It is India's birthday weekend, our milestone, 75th milestone as a free nation. But many of us forget that before the freedom came the carnage called partition that so many do not even wish to remember and many don't even know anything of. I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo Story. On the program today, we are doing a deep dive into a very, very important book, Hymns in Blood. Actually, a grandson's translation of his grandfather's seminal work. A work that, though written decades back, has a very profound resonance for the India of today. And reminds us also that there is no building a future till you actually confront, understand, and embrace your past. Let's introduce our guest on the program today. We are joined by Ambassador Navdeep Singh Suri. We know him, of course, as a veteran diplomat and commentator on strategic affairs, but he's, of course, also an accomplished author. And he's here today as the proud grandson of Nanak Singh, the novelist and writer, whose work he has now translated from Punjabi into English for wider and more varied access in the 75th year of India's independence. Thank you so much, Ambassador Navdeep Singh. It's a pleasure always to see you. Let me start by asking you, when I was reading the book and I read your grandfather's introduction to his own novel that spoke about a time when all religious communities lived in harmony. It's actually a fictionalized novel, but the preface is written with the reality of partition in mind. I actually had goosebumps because I kept thinking that this is the India of 1947, but this could be a warning he's giving to the India of 2022, and we'll get into all of that. But I want to ask you, what made you decide? When did you decide to actually translate your grandfather's works, and why?
Okay, thank you, Barkha, for having me on your show. So my grandfather was a really prolific writer. He was unlettered. He didn't get a schooling beyond fourth grade because he was orphaned when he was 9 or 10 years old in Peshawar. And yet he proceeded to write 38 novels, a total of 59 books, and he sort of acquired this moniker of the father of the Punjabi novel, because there was really no tradition of the secular novel in Punjabi until he came on the literary scene. I was born in a family of literature. My mother was a professor of Punjabi language. My father was a publisher. And my mom would keep nudging me all the time that, look, your grandfather, when I teach him, not as a daughter-in-law, but as a professor of Punjabi, I see that he was such a genius of a storyteller. And if only he had written in some other language, he would have had a much bigger following. So you're the only one in the family whose English is halfway decent. So why don't you try and translate? Why don't you pick up the mantle and translate some of his work? So the first one I translated about 10 years back was his classic novel, Pavitra Papi, which was published as The Watchmaker. The second was a book called Ad Khidya Full. And then I did his masterly ballad on the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, which he wrote, Khoon Vaisakhi, after surviving the massacre. And once I was done with that, I was looking at what next. And I thought, well, since India is going to be celebrating 75 years of independence, and there are many reasons to celebrate all the achievements of the country, but it's also time for reflection about the price that was paid. And since he wrote these two wonderful back-to-back novels about life in Punjab, undivided, in Rawalpindi or Pothohar, and also in Amritsar, about the partition, I said, let me pick these up and provide a perspective that is new to non-Punjabi readers about that particular point of time. And especially since both these novels, Hymns in Blood and the next one, A Game of Fire, are set in the first 8 months of 1947. And this one was published in February 48, and the other one in September 48. So they are raw, they are immediate, they convey a sense of contemporary history, even though the accounts might be somewhat fictionalized.
Yeah, and that was a fascinating thing, that the preface is actually completely, deeply factual, political, contemporary, and then of course comes the fictional account of a happier time of undivided Punjab before partition. Now, you're sitting in Amritsar right now, and the portrait that we can see just behind your right shoulder is that of your grandfather, Nanak Ji. And I want you to read a little bit. Firstly, I'm just overwhelmed at the thought of this unlettered man, evolving into the father of Punjabi literature, and extraordinary. And uh, I, I come from a partition family myself, so I know some of these stories. I grew up hearing some of them. But for, as you said, the non-Punjabi audience who has no sense of that time, I want you to read a little bit from the introduction, and then we'll talk a little bit more.
So in the foreword that he writes, and this is one of the longer forewords that he's written, he explains why is he writing this particular novel? Why is he telling this story? And he says, maybe it was this picture imprinted in my eyes, an image of my beautiful and vibrant Punjab, which I have not just seen with my eyes, but also experienced with my soul. Much of my childhood and youth were spent in a milieu where the Muslim and non-Muslim communities lived in complete harmony, where they didn't just live as peaceful, but were ready to sacrifice their lives for their neighbor's sake, where every plate of food and glass of water was shared. Pieces of that picture lie shattered around me today, and this novel is an attempt to show my readers some of those pieces. But this book isn't just a novel. It is a reflection of the ache in my heart, the scream from the very pits of my stomach, the wail from the depths of my soul. In writing this book, my pen has relied on the tears flowing from my eyes as much as it has on the ink from my ink pot. Everyone around me speaks of the numbers. How many Sikhs have been massacred? How many Hindus have been killed? How many Muslims have been slaughtered? But for this unfortunate writer, the biggest casualty was humanity itself. How does it matter if the victim has the long hair of the Sikh, the shikha of the Hindu, or the circumcision of the Muslim? The blood coursing through their veins is the same color of red. The tears flowing from their eyes have the same salt. Try as I might, I haven't been able to discern any difference in the grief-stricken wails of a Hindu, a Sikh, or a Muslim woman as she cradles the lifeless body of her son.
Yeah, it actually is such a visual sort of account that you can picture it, And what I want to ask you is this: the shadows of partition are long, and an entire generation or two of Indians have spent their time escaping those shadows. I used to try and persuade my uncle, my father's eldest brother, who's like my grandfather, that come, I'll take you back to see your old home in Lahore, in Sialkot. And he would absolutely refuse because the wounds were so raw. When you were translating this, and if you had to tell today's Indian why it's important to understand what happened in partition, what is that lesson? Because as I said, there's a lot of resonance for the India of today, wrought as we are, divided, argumentative again by debates around religion and identity.
Yes, and I think, Barkha, there to me two enduring messages that come out of the book. One is that for all its violence, rape, pillage, all of the stuff that happened in what is now Pakistan against the Hindu and Sikh communities, your family being one of them, countless millions others, the novel also tells you the story of heroic Muslim characters who are ready to sacrifice their own lives to stand besides their Hindu and Sikh neighbors. And so the message that you get, firstly, is that humanity survives even in the most extreme circumstances. And that humanity, in a sense, is what he laments became a casualty during the partition. But the second message, I think, which is very, very relevant, is beware the voices of leaders who will stir communal passions. In this book, he talks about Jinnah and the Muslim League as the principal drivers of what happened. In the sequel, it is equally the Akali Dal and the Arya Samaj who are blamed. And he doesn't take the easy path of saying the Angrez did it.
Yeah.
He says, we knew that this is what they would do. We knew their machinations after 200 years of experience. What is wrong with us that we fell upon each other in the way that we did? And so I think the enduring message, which is as relevant today as it was 75 years ago, is if you unleash these primeval passions of religion, you do not know where they are going to, the inferno will move, who will get singed by it. Be careful.
I think the words he uses are actually blood and fire. If I'm not wrong, in your introduction, from the Punjabi into the English, it's about a nation that's playing with blood and fire. And he wrote this in 1948, and I'm thinking in 2022 that this is something that Indians need to pay attention to. I want to go back to partition a little bit, and then we'll come back to contemporary India. Ashish Nandi has this seminal project on memory and partition, and his basic argument, Ambassador, was that the more you try and suppress a memory, the less you heal. And India and Pakistan's schizophrenia, there are many reasons for it. You've been a diplomat, you don't need me to tell you this. The way the structures of power are organized, the theocracy that is Pakistan, the democracy, pluralistic that is India, and so on. But the schizophrenia also goes back to this rupture. To the partition of a people who didn't quite believe this was happening, who didn't even properly lock up their homes as they fled because they thought they would go back. So if you were to join the dots with your grandfather's writing and that delusion of that time, what did you find as you translated his works?
Well, we grew up listening to the stories. In fact, amongst us as kids growing up in Amritsar, we would make fun of it because the moment there was some nostalgic reference to the past. My grandparents, for example, would always say, "Oh, every koi dudh ta reh gaya laur." Anything that you liked wasn't good enough now because it was you were in a transplanted culture, and the authentic was what you left behind. And I think that nostalgia worked for a long time. And, the trauma works in different persons, I think, in different ways. I tried to look closely at the trauma of Jallianwala Bagh massacre on my grandfather. And, after surviving the massacre, he wrote this long ballad, but he never spoke about it. In fact, except one line in his autobiography, there is no mention ever of his poem Khoon Vaisakhi anywhere. And my grandmother used to tell us, because she outlived him by some 25 years, and she used to tell us that, your Bauji had closed that chapter. He never wanted to talk to anyone.
It's like post-traumatic stress disorder, that you shut down when you witness something that has traumatized you to the bone. Can you talk a little bit about him surviving the Jallianwala Bagh massacre? I think a large part of our audience may not know about that.
So he had moved to Amritsar from Peshawar about a year back in 1918 and was making Amritsar his home. He had gone to the Bagh with two of his friends to protest against the Rowlatt Act. And then, of course, General Dyer came and the firing happened. And both his friends were killed in the massacre. He was knocked unconscious in the stampede, left for dead, and walked away from that with some injury to his hearing and so on. But wrote this searing long poem called Khoon Vaisakhi, which was first published in May 1920 and promptly banned by the British, and all copies were confiscated. And the book was lost to us in the family for the next 60 years. And it wasn't until 1980, by a sheer coincidence, that my father discovered it and published it again. And I kind of translated it for the centenary of Jallianwala Bagh in 2019.
Extraordinary. When people say, why are we discussing partition? Let's talk about our Azadi. Why do we talk about partition? You would say what?
I think let's talk about independence. Let's celebrate independence by all means. Let's do Har Ghar Mein Tiranga. Let's do all of that. I get a little wary when we also start celebrating officially something called Remembrances of the Horrors of Partition on August 14, because I think that doesn't heal old wounds. It can actually, nick again at the scars and make them come alive. So I think the difference is that through his books, my grandfather constantly is trying to give a message of healing rather than division. And this is something that he made a mission in his life. He writes in his autobiography how deeply influenced he was by Munshi Premchand, and decided that his mission and his calling in life is going to be to write novels that will bring out reforms in society. And so each of his novels will take a theme or two and bring out, not only what the problem is, but through his characters, through the storyline, he will also try to give you some better ways to deal with it.
Yeah. And so you're basically saying that if you're not comfortable with a kind of, as it were, doubling down on trauma, instead to look for, those strands of hope. Now, some would call you a candle waving Punjabi romantic. Kuldeep Nair, also from Amritsar, was famously called that because he would go to the Wagha-Attari border and he would hold candles and he would talk about peace with Pakistan and so on. You've been in the sort of inside corridors of power and done hard strategy, so it would be tougher to call you that. But there are a lot of people who say, hey, Navdeep, you're just being romantic about this whole thing. What peace? Kya peace? Sab khatam, wo zamana kuch aur tha. You would say...
Let me tell you a story. I came to Amritsar about 10 years back. I had started something called Lectures on Indian Foreign Policy when I was head of public diplomacy. I brought one of our distinguished diplomats who has a fairly hard line on Pakistan to speak at Guru Nanak Dev University. And he had notions about the Punjabi valor and how they fight on the borders and all of that. And he got roundly accosted after the lecture and when he opened up for Q&A. And a lot of the commentary that came to him was, you guys sitting in Delhi make policy without realizing the consequences that it has on the people on the ground. We want trade so that our economy can improve. We want people-to-people contacts. We want cultural connects. There is a shared Punjabi culture on both sides of the border. So this is not a romantic notion. And I'm certainly not, having fought in the trenches for 36 years, in diplomacy.
Yeah, I'm just being the devil's advocate here. But I would say that, yeah.
I'm fairly battle-hardened. But I think the striking thing here is that Punjab, which paid the most extreme price for independence during the partition, seems to be the one state that has largely gotten over the emotional trauma and is ready to make peace. The further away you move from Punjab towards the heartland, the harder the opinions appear to be. And I don't quite get it, that what is it that has enabled the Punjabis to overcome, to a large extent, their bitterness and trauma in the next generation and say, life moves on? Is it just
could it be because the collective memory of a shared commonality, which is what your grandfather's book really invokes, is something that Punjab experienced, that Bengal experienced, that these border states, that as we now call them, experienced. And the further you move away from the border, that maybe that shared history is not there.
Yes, and possibly the centuries of a shared culture and language trump new borders. You have a Radcliffe line, which is 75 years old, but a shared culture which goes back centuries. And that is a stronger force. I mean, I don't take it for granted. We shouldn't be complacent about it. I think there is enough in madness in everybody that we can destroy all that is precious. But still, overseas, when you are not wearing your diplomatic hat, and you hear these stories all the time, that when one Punjabi from Amritsar, say, runs into somebody from Lahore, immediately they connect and start speaking in Punjabi, to the detriment of anybody else who might be in the room. And that's the power of language and culture, which is shared, which is, I think, a stronger force than religion.
And in the introduction to your grandfather's book, Hymns in Blood, he actually talks about specifically about Sare Jahan Se Acha and Iqbal, and how did it come to be that a man who eventually, chose Pakistan actually wrote our Sare Jahan Se Acha Hindustan Hamara. I mean, these are some of the paradoxes. I'm not even sure, like, people today even know this.
Barkha, I was having a very interesting conversation about this book with somebody who's from Aligarh. And he said this was an eye-opener for him because he said life for the Muslim and Hindu communities in Aligarh pre-partition was so different from the story that is being portrayed in this book about the way the communities celebrate every festival together, whether it is Lohri or Diwali or Baisakhi or anything else. And sometimes the texture of those festivals, the way they are celebrated and the way the narrative is in the book tells you about life in rural Punjab at that point of time. And he said, people need to understand that how closely woven the fabric of the communities was at that time.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about how Amritsar today seems different to you. I don't know, again, how many people know, but actually, please correct me if I'm wrong, was it till the 1960s that there was no sort of closed border? You could kind of drive in for cricket matches. I mean, it has to have been before 65, of course, when the war breaks out. But maybe the early 60s, I think it was a pretty crossable, easy to access border for both sides. And how is it different today?
Well, if you look at the depth of the fissures initially, Barkha, and I was when I was researching for this book, I was looking at some of the census data, and it struck me that in 1941, which was the last census before partition, Amritsar had a 43% Muslim population, and yet the Amritsar that I grew up in the 60s and 70s and 80s, there was hardly any Muslim that you would see. Today, I can see that, some of those old mosques in the heart of Amritsar and Hal Bazaar and Chowk Paragdas and all are again coming alive because so many migrant workers from Bihar and UP have come into Punjab, and you can see some of that. So the ethnic cleansing that happened in Amritsar was complete, absolute. And yet, my parents, when I was growing up, would go across. They were amongst those who would not only go to Lahore to watch a cricket match in the early 60s, but also come back with imported goodies. Because those days, Pakistan was the more open economy than India. And so this was there were some favorite things that they would go and buy in Lahore. And people again forget that it is only 35 miles from Amritsar to Lahore. These were historically twin cities that complemented each other. Lahore was the political capital, Amritsar was the commercial capital. And there was this symbiotic relationship between them, which was ruptured by partition.
Let's come back to the book. The other thing that really leaps out is Nanak Singh's desire for balance. He's very careful, and this is so different from what we see today when everybody's just identifying themselves with their own ideological camps. He says he's not a historian, but he wants to be accurate in not being unfair to any religious community, to actually show that all of these communities, the Sikhs, the Muslims, the Hindus, the Christians, are capable of great, deep compassion and also deep baseness and violence. Where do you locate that struggle within him? And I know that even in his sequel to this book, I know you and I have spoken about this, there's a powerful moment when he as a Sikh has to confront this reality.
Yeah, and so in the sequel, Agdi Khed in Punjabi, which is a game of fire, which I'm translating now, there's this really powerful moment, and this is on the 8th of March, 1947. And the violence begins around Holi, which is the 5th of March. And he says this year, unfortunately, we are playing Holi with our blood rather than with the usual colors. But there's this very powerful moment where he hears shouts from an area called Chowk Paragdas, which is very close to the Golden Temple, but it's a predominantly Muslim area. And he runs expecting that he's going to see a horde of Muslims wearing Turkish fez caps and carrying daggers and shouting Ya Hussein and Ya Ali. And yet when he reaches there, he sees that it's actually a crowd wearing black turbans. And instead of the daggers, they have the kirpans. And instead of Ya Ali, they are shouting Jo Bole Sohile. And there's a protagonist in the book, Satnam, who's kind of loosely tailored after him. And he speaks about witnessing the horror of innocent men, women, and children being hacked to death in a house. And my grandfather, in his autobiography, narrates his sense of helplessness when he sees that. And you know, I had conversations with my father about partition before he died a few months ago, and I said, "What do you remember from? You were 15 at that time. You were in Amritsar. What do you remember?" And he said, "Well, I remember your father once, your grandfather once coming home with his clothes drenched in blood." And when we asked him, he said nothing. But later we found that he had rescued some Muslim children from a mosque and taken them to the hospital, and his clothes were still drenched in that blood. So he being the humanist that he was, and in the foreword of the second book, he says that I'm a religious person. I believe in Guru Nanak and his message. But if I have one enduring message, that is that about a universal sense of humanity. And for me, anytime that there's a clash between humanity and religion, I will say religion is your personal matter, humanity is universal.
Well, religion went quite public this last couple of days with Salman Rushdie living with a fatwa on his head for more than 3 decades, coming under attack, fighting for his life. Someone who again warned again and again in all of his writings, his interviews, his conversations against the kind of irrationality that extreme thought can actually create. You know, you're a writer, you're a diplomat, but you're also a writer. When you saw what happened to Rushdie, I mean, and you thought of your grandfather as this writer, this legend of his time, also a literary giant, what did you think?
I think, what happened to Rushdie is really inexcusable. And it again shows the damage that narrow religious bigotry the havoc that it can play with people's minds, the indoctrination that happens. God knows, we've seen enough examples of it. Coming from Amritsar, we saw the Bhindranwale period. Yeah. And the reign of terror that was unleashed in Punjab. And I don't even want to go into the politics of it, but the indoctrination and the numbing savagery that it can produce was writ large. You've seen decades of it through Al-Qaeda and ISIS. There are examples in every religion of this virus, which can really wreck your brain if you allow it to invade you. And I think my grandfather's message consistently is beware of this religious bigotry. It will only produce loss and hatred. There will be no winners out of it. And I think that's what Salman Rushdie's case also, in a sense, exemplifies. That, it could be Salman Rushdie being attacked, presumably by a Muslim fanatic in this case. But no religion has a monopoly on fanaticism, and there's enough of it going around everywhere, I think, these days. And that's what you want to be aware of.
Absolutely. Khoon Sohile, or Hymns in Blood, the very name captures, I think as one of the reviews said, poetry as witness, literature as witness to trauma, but also the possibility of something better, something more hopeful, a gentler time invoked at a time of bloodlust, ugliness, divisiveness. And as we approach India at 75, we cannot but pause to remember also through this extremely important translation by Ambassador Navdeep of his grandfather's work, the horror and the lessons of partition. Thank you so much, Navdeep. Take care, and we look forward to the sequel.
Thank you, Barkha.
Thank you.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.